On one level, I would say that fake news is an old problem and a very established issue for media literacy educators. We've been teaching about news for many, many years. Fake news is perhaps a particular problem in a digital age where it's easily circulated, but actually these questions about truth and falsehood, about objectivity, fairness, balance, bias, these are really very familiar questions for media educators. They're questions that we actually have very good approaches for dealing with. At the same time, I would say that fake news is actually not just a small problem in itself. I'd want to argue that fake news is perhaps a symptom of a bigger problem. And the bigger problem is really what I would call digital capitalism. It's an issue to do with a very small number of companies who are really now dominating the wider media landscape, and obviously particularly social media. Fake news is a symptom of that, it's a manifestation of that, but we need to look at fake news within that wider context. Only this week we're seeing the scandal over Cambridge Analytica, this company that harvested 50 million users' Facebook data with the permission of Facebook and then sold it on to political campaigns. Now, I think in a way this dramatizes something that is a much bigger issue within the social media landscape, because they're not just selling data to political campaigns, they're selling data to advertisers, to commercial companies. And so we need to be thinking much harder about the nature of that business model, that social media seem to be free to users, but actually social media are funded on the basis of the buying and selling of data. So this is a key issue for media educators to be teaching about. I'm not so sure that many people really understand, whether they're children or young people or adults actually. I'm not sure that too many adults really understand the economics of social media. And it's an absolutely crucial issue for media educators. Yeah, I think in the last couple of years we've seen increasing levels of public concern about the impact of social media. For a long time the concern was one to do with negative forms of risk. It was about pornography, paedophiles, but it came to be about online radicalization. Now we're seeing new waves of concern, particularly about privacy. Fake news would be another manifestation of this. So now we have what's becoming quite a long list of concerns about social media. Now, on one level, we could call these moral panics, if you like. In some ways, there are some things in common between these concerns and actually the very, very long history of concern about different media. So the concern here goes back to earlier concerns about computer games, about television, about the cinema, and actually about literature and novel reading. All of these things have been seen to have various damaging, harmful effects, particularly on young people. So in some ways, this is the same kind of phenomenon, and we can analyze it in the same kind of way. We need to look at who's making these arguments, how useful is the evidence, and what is the evidence pointing towards, what solutions are being proposed to these problems. At the same time, I worry slightly with this term moral panic, as though there's an assumption that these are concerns that are kind of irrational. There are other people who have these concerns, whereas those of us who are more rational, who are better informed, don't share those concerns. I think there's a bit of an us and them thing that goes on in this debate. It's far too easy to dismiss things as moral panics. I think we need to look harder at the very real motivations that people have for the concerns that they are expressing. In some cases they are exaggerating, in some cases they are actually making these arguments for quite different and perhaps quite the wrong reasons. But we need to take them seriously. There's a bit of a danger in dismissing them, that we then assume that, yes, we've seen it all before, nothing changes, everything's okay, let's just carry on as usual. Well, in the UK we have a very, very long history of media education. I could point to you examples from actually the 1930s of people teaching about advertising, teaching about news. They obviously weren't calling it fake news at that time, but they were teaching about these topics. And certainly since the 1960s, 1970s, we've had media studies as a subject in schools. Media studies is often not taken seriously, it's often ridiculed, it's still quite marginal, unfortunately, and there are many of us who have been pushing for it to be seen as really a fundamental entitlement for all children. But what we do have, I think, is quite a long history of practice, and we've also been quite reflexive in that practice. So we've looked at what works and what doesn't work. We've asked the difficult questions about how effective any of this is. So I think we have many, many examples of, for example, ways that we might teach about a phenomenon like fake news, how we might analyse news media, and that history goes back a very long way.